On the morning of April 28, 2026, a statement went out from the UAE's Ministry of Energy that was polite, measured, and wrapped in diplomatic courtesy. It expressed appreciation for OPEC's leadership. It praised the Saudis for years of partnership. It wished the organization success in its future endeavors. And then it announced that the United Arab Emirates, the Gulf's most economically dynamic nation, the region's financial powerhouse, one of OPEC's 3 most consequential members for nearly 6 decades, was leaving. Effective May 1st, 4 days away. Done. The phones of energy analysts across London, New York, Houston, Singapore, and Riyadh lit up simultaneously. The oil market moved. Governments that depend on OPEC's ability to manage global crude prices began emergency consultations. And inside the Saudi government, inside the kingdom that has led OPEC since its founding, that has used the cartel as the primary instrument of its global economic power for generations, the implications of what Abu Dhabi had just done began to settle like cold water through a very warm room. Because this was not just a country leaving an organization, this was the second most powerful member walking out on the dominant member's watch. This was the Gulf's most strategically independent state declaring publicly and permanently that it would no longer subordinate its national interests to the collective architecture that Saudi Arabia built and controlled. This was a crack, visible, undeniable, and potentially widening, in the foundation of Saudi Arabia's most important source of global leverage, and it came at the worst possible moment. In the middle of a regional war, with the Strait of Hormuz partially closed, with Vision 2030 depending on stability and revenue that the war was already threatening, and with MBS in the middle of the most consequential strategic recalculation of his reign. To understand how we got here, you have to understand what OPEC actually is, not the organization described in dry economic textbooks, but what it actually represents as a tool of Saudi power. OPEC was founded in the 1960s by Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Iran, Iraq, and Venezuela. The cartel hit the headlines in 1973 when an alliance of its Arab members implemented an embargo on countries supporting Israel. It was the first time that Arab states had exercised this sort of collective action, and it had enormous consequences on the world stage. The 1973 oil embargo, the moment America sat in gasoline lines stretching around city blocks, the moment oil-dependent Western economies felt genuine fear about their fundamental vulnerability, was the moment that defined OPEC's power in the world's imagination. That moment proved that a group of oil-producing nations, coordinated by Saudi Arabia, could shake the entire global economy, could change the behavior of superpowers, could weaponize a commodity in ways that military force never could. That lesson was never forgotten in Riyadh. OPEC became the instrument through which Saudi Arabia exercised global influence that its military power alone could never deliver, by coordinating production among member states, raising output when prices threatened to spike and choke off demand, cutting output when prices fell, and threatened to starve the kingdom of the revenue it needed. Saudi Arabia positioned itself as the world's indispensable energy manager, the swing producer, the country whose decision to turn the tap slightly more open or slightly more closed determined whether the global economy paid $70 a barrel or 110. The power is not just economic, it is political, it is diplomatic. It is the reason that American presidents fly to Riyadh and ask for things they would never ask from a country of Saudi Arabia's military size. It is the foundation on which Vision 2030 rests, because all those billions of dollars flowing into tourism megaprojects and futuristic cities and international football leagues come ultimately from oil revenue managed to stay as high as possible for as long as possible. And the instrument that made that management possible was OPEC, with the UAE inside it. Now the UAE is outside it. And the consequences for Saudi Arabia's ability to manage the market, to exercise the swing producer power that is the foundation of its global influence, are being assessed with growing urgency by analysts who understand what has actually been lost. The UAE was the most influential member of OPEC behind Saudi Arabia. It was one of the few members, along with Saudi Arabia, that had meaningful spare production capacity to influence prices and respond to supply shocks. Saudi Arabia and the UAE together control a majority of the world's total spare capacity of more than 4 million barrels per day, making them particularly influential during periods of distress. The UAE's departure therefore removes one of the core pillars underpinning OPEC's ability to manage the market. OPEC will become structurally weaker as a consequence. Spare capacity. This is the concept at the heart of why the UAE's departure matters so much more than the departures of Qatar, Indonesia, Ecuador, and Angola, all of which happened in previous years without creating existential concern about OPEC's viability. Spare capacity is not just oil in the ground. Every petrostate has oil in the ground. Spare capacity is oil that can be brought to market quickly, within weeks or months, when the world needs it, when a hurricane destroys Gulf of Mexico production, when a political crisis in Nigeria shuts down exports, when a war closes a major shipping route. The countries with meaningful spare capacity are the ones that can step into those gaps, stabilize markets, and in doing so, exercise enormous leverage over the global economy. For decades, the countries with that capacity have been Saudi Arabia and the UAE. Together, they controlled the buffer that kept the world's oil supply stable. With the UAE's exit, Saudi Arabia will remain the only swing producer with sufficient spare capacity to exert market influence and respond to supply shocks. This will constrain the grouping's leveraging power, which lies in collective coordinated supply management. Stabilizing prices will become more expensive and difficult to sustain for the kingdom. A weaker coalition raises the risk of competitive production strategies, something the UAE's diversified economy may withstand, but could place considerable pressure on other OPEC members. Saudi Arabia will now be alone as the world's swing producer, alone in the burden of managing prices, alone in absorbing the cost of cutting production when the market is oversupplied, alone in the enormous financial discipline required to maintain spare capacity that sits idle, generating no revenue, costing money to maintain, consuming the patience of a government that needs that revenue to fund everything from military salaries to Vision 2030 megaprojects. That burden, when shared with the UAE, was manageable. Alone, it is significantly heavier, and every time Saudi Arabia cuts to support prices, the UAE, now unconstrained by any OPEC quota, can produce at full capacity and sell into the market that Saudi Arabia just propped up. Saudi Arabia pays the cost of price stability. The UAE captures the benefit. This is not a partnership. This is competitive free-riding. And it is now the permanent structure of the relationship between the Gulf's two most important oil economies. But to understand why the UAE left, and why the timing of this departure says so much about the deeper fractures in Gulf politics, you have to go back to what the war did to the relationship between Abu Dhabi and Riyadh. Because these two countries, which for years projected an image of near seamless Gulf unity, have been moving in opposite directions on some of the most consequential geopolitical questions of the decade. And the Iran war accelerated and crystallized those divergences in ways that made the OPEC exit feel, to many analysts, less like a sudden decision and more like the final visible expression of a split that had been building for years. The shock announcement comes after the UAE was the target of missile and drone attacks for weeks by fellow OPEC member Iran. Tehran's attacks on shipping in the Strait of Hormuz severely constrained the UAE's ability to export oil, threatening the foundation of its economy. Iran, which is itself an OPEC member, or was until its status became complicated by the war, attacked the UAE with missiles and drones, attacked a fellow OPEC member's territory, and the UAE, whose economy depends on its ports, its aviation hub, its logistics supremacy, its reputation as the region's safest and most open business destination, watched all of that being threatened by a country it sat alongside in the same cartel. The absurdity of that situation, of maintaining membership in an organization that includes the country that was bombing your airports and threatening your shipping, was not lost on Abu Dhabi's leadership. Saudi Arabia has come to view Israel and its actions as a threat to regional security, and therefore sees the UAE's alignment with Israel in a poor light. As a result, the UAE's posture has become a growing source of frustration for Riyadh. The Iran war has exacerbated the differences that the Emirates felt. The UAE normalized relations with Israel in 2020, the Abraham Accords, the deal that MBS himself was close to signing before October 7th intervened and made it politically impossible. Abu Dhabi was the first Arab country to take that step, and it did so with enthusiasm, with genuine strategic intent, building real economic and security ties with Israel in ways that went far beyond the symbolic. And Saudi Arabia, which views Israeli military dominance as its own strategic threat, which has been deepening its rapprochement with Turkey and Qatar and Pakistan, which publicly condemned Israeli strikes on Iran, finds the UAE's Israel alignment increasingly uncomfortable. Two Gulf neighbors, bound by decades of apparent unity, are now on opposite sides of the region's defining geopolitical fault line. The UAE is aligned with Israel and the Abraham Accords camp, the countries that see Iran's defeat and Israeli security cooperation as the foundation of a stable Gulf. Saudi Arabia is building the alternative bloc, the Turkey-Pakistan-Egypt alignment, the MBS-led coalition that insists on Palestinian rights and opposes Israeli regional hegemony. These are not minor differences in emphasis. They are fundamentally incompatible visions for what the Middle East should look like in the decade to come. And in that context, the UAE's departure from OPEC is not just an energy policy decision. It is a geopolitical statement. It says, we are pursuing our own path. Our national interests and your national interests have diverged enough that we can no longer subordinate ours to the collective framework you control. The UAE's exit follows Qatar's own departure from OPEC in 2019, suggesting that Gulf states are increasingly prioritizing national strategies over collective frameworks. The move reinforces existing divisions within the GCC, where coordination has often been limited despite shared security concerns. The Gulf Cooperation Council, the regional body that was supposed to represent unified Gulf Arab interests, has been quietly fracturing for years. Qatar's departure from OPEC in 2019, the blockade of Qatar by Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Bahrain, and Egypt from 2017 to 2021, the Saudi UAE tensions over the Yemen war and its aftermath, the divergence on Israel, the different responses to the Iran war. What looked from the outside like Gulf unity has been, for years, a series of bilateral relationships managed carefully to prevent open rupture. And the Iran war has provided the conditions for ruptures that were previously contained to become visible. Now consider the economic dimension of what MBS is now facing, because the UAE's exit does not happen in isolation. It happens at the moment when Saudi Arabia's own economic model is under the most intense pressure it has faced since the Vision 2030 project began. Now that Hormuz has been closed once, there will always be the risk that it could happen again. This poses a long-term threat to Saudi Arabia's trade flows and economic transformation plans. Repeated or prolonged disruption would weigh on revenues, investor confidence, and the kingdom's ability to present itself as a stable hub for trade, logistics, and finance. The ambitions of Vision 2030 and its successor frameworks depend on predictable energy and revenue flows and a secure maritime environment. The Strait of Hormuz is not just a shipping lane. For Saudi Arabia, it is the pipeline through which the kingdom's economic future flows. Roughly 90% of Saudi Arabia's oil exports transit the strait. The Vision 2030 projects, NEOM, the Red Sea tourism development, the entertainment districts, the sports investments, all of them are funded by oil revenue. All of that oil revenue depends on being able to ship oil through a narrow body of water that Iran demonstrated it could threaten with missiles and mines. The Hormuz closure lasted weeks before the ceasefire. Even now, with the ceasefire technically in place, the risk of another closure hangs over every financial model that underpins Saudi Arabia's economic transformation. Every foreign investor considering a commitment to Vision 2030 is now running a Hormuz risk scenario they did not have to run before February 2026. Saudi Arabia's sovereign wealth fund PIF has begun pulling back from high-profile overseas commitments, including Live Golf and its sponsorship and partnerships linked to the Metropolitan Opera in New York. It has also agreed the partial sale of a major stake in Al Hilal, one of the kingdom's flagship football clubs. 3 others, Al Nasser, Al Ahly, and Al Ittihad, are up next. This signals a move toward more cautious spending and tighter capital discipline, and away from vanity projects. This is a striking and significant development that deserves careful attention. The Public Investment Fund, the sovereign wealth fund that has been MBS's primary instrument for projecting Saudi soft power and building international relationships through sports, entertainment, and culture, is pulling back. Live Golf, which cost billions and generated enormous controversy, is being wound down. Partnerships with American cultural institutions are being ended. Saudi football clubs are being partially sold. The era of sovereign and wealth fund spending as a geopolitical and image management tool is being replaced by something more disciplined, more cautious, more focused on the fundamentals of economic security rather than the optics of global ambition. MBS is recalibrating. The man who built his reputation on bold, sometimes impulsive strokes, the Vision 2030 announcement, the Ritz-Carlton detention of rival princes, the Yemen intervention, is now in a phase of strategic reassessment driven by hard lessons. MBS learned 2 painful lessons over the Saudi intervention in Yemen. 1, there's a cost to impulsive decision-making. 2, there's no such thing as a quick war. This might explain his reluctance to participate in the war against Iran or even cheerlead for it. The Iran war has once again slowed the kingdom's decision-making process as the leadership reassesses its long-term strategy. It is acutely aware that whatever the outcome of the conflict, it will determine the region's future for at least the next 2 decades. 2 decades. That is the time frame MBS is thinking in, not the next election cycle. There are no elections in Saudi Arabia that constrain his tenure, not the next quarterly earnings report. 2 decades. The Iran war, he understands, is not an episode. It is a turning point. Whatever emerges from it, whether Iran's regime survives in some form or collapses entirely, whether a nuclear deal is eventually reached or the program is permanently dismantled, whether the Gulf security architecture is rebuilt around American dominance or something more multipolar, the outcome will shape the region's power structure for a generation. And Saudi Arabia, which was not a party to the war but whose interests were profoundly affected by it, is now repositioning itself for that post-war order. Saudi Arabia's reassessment now centers on the Strait of Hormuz. There is a renewed focus on domestic industries essential to its national development and economic security. Projects along Saudi Arabia's western coastline, including ports, industrial zones, and tourism developments, will now become key priorities. The country's two coastlines give it a significant geographical advantage over its neighbors, which it will look to capitalize on, especially from the UAE, as the region's main export hub, the Red Sea. This is the geographic pivot at the center of MBS's strategic reassessment. Saudi Arabia has two coastlines, the Persian Gulf coast, which faces the Hormuz vulnerability, and the Red Sea coast, which does not. The Red Sea coast connects directly to the Suez Canal, to European markets, to African trade routes, without passing through any narrow strait that Iran can threaten. And the Saudi coastline on the Red Sea is long, mostly undeveloped and adjacent to the projects, Neom, Amala, Sindalah, that MBS has been building as the showcase of Vision 2030. Those projects now look not just like economic diversification, but like strategic infrastructure, the alternative export pathway that reduces Saudi dependence on a choke point that Iran can threaten. But here is where the competition with the UAE becomes acute and consequential. The UAE is building a strategic network of ports and military bases across the Red Sea and Horn of Africa to secure global trade routes and project economic influence. Their competition for influence in the Red Sea is set to sharpen. Control over access, routes, and security along the waterway will become increasingly central to Saudi Arabia's economic and strategic calculations. The UAE, recognizing the same geographic logic, that the future of Gulf commercial power runs through the Red Sea and not the Persian Gulf, has been building its own network of ports and military bases across the Horn of Africa and the Red Sea coast for years. Dubai's DP World operates ports from Djibouti to Somaliland. Abu Dhabi has military bases in Eritrea and Somalia. The UAE is positioned to be the logistics hub of the post-Hormuz risk Gulf commercial order. And Saudi Arabia is now awakening to the fact that its closest neighbor and former OPEC partner has been quietly building the infrastructure that could make Abu Dhabi, rather than Riyadh, the essential node in the region's commercial geography. This is competition at a level that the two countries have rarely acknowledged publicly. Saudi Arabia and the UAE have always maintained the diplomatic fiction that they are brothers. And in many ways, they genuinely are, bound by history, religion, family ties, and shared security interests. But brothers can compete. Brothers can pursue incompatible visions of who leads the family. And in the Red Sea, that competition is now structural, geographic, and backed by billions of dollars on both sides. Every Saudi port development on the western coast is implicitly competing with UAE port operations in Djibouti and the Horn. Every Vision 2030 project that redirects trade, flows through Saudi territory, is implicitly reducing the commercial transit that flows through Dubai's ports and Abu Dhabi's logistics networks. Separately, Saudi Arabia has pushed for its capital Riyadh to vie with neighboring UAE metropolises Abu Dhabi and Dubai for leadership in the region. Saudi Arabia has also committed to investing in its domestic upstream oil sector. The UAE has a much lower fiscal oil price break-even relative to its peers, leaving its economy relatively resilient and better able to sustain a potential period of low prices. This fiscal difference is critical and underappreciated in most coverage of the UAE's OPEC exit. Saudi Arabia needs approximately $90 per barrel to balance its budget. The UAE's break-even is roughly half that, which means that if the UAE's exit and subsequent unconstrained production pushes global oil prices down, which many analysts expect over the medium term, the UAE can sustain its economy comfortably at prices that would create genuine fiscal pressure for Saudi Arabia. MBS needs high oil prices to fund everything from military salaries to NEOM to social programs that keep Saudi society stable. The UAE can operate profitably in a world of $50 oil. Saudi Arabia, increasingly, cannot. The decision of the United Arab Emirates to withdraw from OPEC is not just another policy adjustment to the Hormuz crisis. It reflects a deeper cleavage in the global energy governance architecture that for so long relied on geopolitical stability, shared incentives, and equitable risk sharing among producer countries. These conditions no longer hold true. Shared incentives. That phrase captures exactly what has been lost. For decades, Saudi Arabia and the UAE shared the fundamental incentive of keeping oil prices high enough to fund their governments, stable enough to attract investment, and managed collectively through OPEC to prevent the competition among producers that would push prices down to the benefit of consumers and the detriment of the kingdoms. That shared incentive created the foundation for OPEC's discipline, the willingness to cut production when necessary, to hold spare capacity idle, to coordinate sacrifices for collective benefit. But the incentive was never perfectly shared. The UAE, with its lower break-even and more diversified economy, always had more tolerance for lower prices than Saudi Arabia. And as the UAE's economy diversified further, today only 25% of the UAE's revenues come from oil and gas, with 75% from non-oil sectors, such as trade and logistics, tourism, real estate, financial services, and technology. Its stake in high oil prices diminished relative to Saudi Arabia's. The shared incentive weakened. The collective framework became less valuable to Abu Dhabi than the freedom to produce at full capacity and maximize revenue, while global oil demand is still strong enough to absorb the extra supply. The UAE is preparing for a world after the Iran war where oil demand is in decline. OPEC's power to maintain control and discipline will be weaker. This is in contrast to Saudi Arabia's goal of keeping oil production by OPEC members capped in order to maintain high oil prices in the longer term. Peak oil demand. This is the horizon that every oil-producing state is staring at. The point, expected around 2030, at which electric vehicles, renewable energy, and efficiency improvements cause global demand for crude oil to stop growing and begin to decline. Saudi Arabia's Vision 2030 is predicated on the belief that the kingdom can diversify its economy away from oil dependence before that peak arrives. But that diversification takes time, and in the meantime, the kingdom needs oil revenue to fund it. The UAE has a different calculation. Its economy is already substantially diversified, so it can afford to maximize oil production now, sell as much as possible before the peak, and capture revenue that will flow to its sovereign wealth funds and non-oil sectors. Producing less oil for higher prices, which OPEC's strategy demands, is not as attractive when the alternative is producing more oil at slightly lower prices and generating more total revenue from an asset whose long-term value will decline. These are the structural forces that made the UAE's OPEC exit inevitable. Not in the sense that it had to happen at this particular moment, but in the sense that the underlying logic pointing toward it has been building for years. The Iran war and the Hormuz closure simply provided the immediate shock that crystallized what had been slowly forming. The UAE has chafed under years of oil production cuts led by the Saudis. It has watched as Iraq and OPEC Plus member Russia have routinely exceeded their quotas. When the conflict between the USA and Iran ends and the Strait of Hormuz reopens, the UAE will produce as much oil as it can, utilizing any spare capacity held in reserve. Iraq exceeding quotas, Russia exceeding quotas, both continuing to receive OPEC membership and participating in the organization's decisions despite their chronic noncompliance with its rules. The UAE, which has generally been more disciplined in adhering to its quotas, watched this dynamic with growing frustration. The impression that the rules applied to it but not to others, that Saudi Arabia's management of the cartel prioritized political relationships over consistent enforcement of the production discipline that makes OPEC's price management effective. That frustration had been building since at least 2021, when OPEC Plus talks stalled specifically because the UAE demanded, and only partially received, a higher production baseline that better reflected its actual capacity. The grievance was never fully resolved. The UAE accepted a partial compromise and continued operating within a quota it considered inadequate. The Iran war gave it both the motivation and the diplomatic cover to finally walk out the door it had been standing in front of for years. Now what? What does the new landscape look like, and what are the real options available to MBS as he absorbs the implications of what has happened? The most obvious consequence is a weakened Saudi ability to manage oil prices through OPEC. Riyadh will still have a significant ability to discipline the market with its own spare capacity, but it will have a weaker hand now that the UAE is no longer a member. There is significant risk of higher oil price volatility as a result of this decision. Saudi Arabia can still cut its own production to support prices, but every barrel Saudi Arabia takes off the market to prop up prices is a barrel that the UAE, no longer constrained by OPEC quotas, can fill. The leverage that comes from coordinated collective action cannot be replicated by unilateral action. When Saudi Arabia acts alone, it bears all the cost of the production cut and captures a smaller share of the price benefit because other producers who are not cutting absorb market share while prices rise. This has been the classic OPEC free rider problem, and it is now expanded to include the UAE. Although Saudi Arabia will still be the dominant player in OPEC, it will be the only major producer with significant spare capacity and may be forced to cut its production and exports in the future to compensate for increases by the UAE, may be forced to cut its own production to compensate for UAE increases. Read that again. Saudi Arabia, whose oil revenue funds everything from its Vision 2030 ambitions to its military to its social programs, may have to reduce its own export volumes, reducing its own income to prevent the additional UAE supply from crashing prices to levels that threaten Saudi fiscal stability. It is a position of reactive weakness, not the active market management role that Saudi Arabia has exercised for 50 years. But MBS is not a man who accepts weakness passively. He is already responding, and the response is visible in the Red Sea pivot, in the strategic reassessment of NEOM and Western Coast infrastructure, in the PIF pullback from overseas vanity projects, and in the deeper question of whether Saudi Arabia needs to rethink the entire architecture of its oil strategy for the post-OPEC dominance era. The Iran war has given MBS pause for thought. Before MBS, Saudi policy was slow and consensus-driven, and largely predictable. The Crown Prince energized the domestic environment in pursuit of far more assertive and, out at times, unpredictable foreign policy that got Saudi Arabia into hot water. However, the Iran war has once again slowed the kingdom's decision-making process as the leadership reassesses its long-term strategy, slowed the decision-making. For MBS, who moved at extraordinary speed on Vision 2030 announcements, on the Yemen intervention, on the Qatar blockade, on the Ritz-Carlton detentions, on the LIV Golf launch, this deceleration is itself significant. The man who built his brand on boldness is pausing, thinking, reassessing. Not because he has lost confidence, but because he understands that the decisions made in the next year will shape Saudi Arabia's position for the next 2 decades. And in that environment, the costs of another impulsive move, another Yemen, another miscalculation at scale, are too high to risk. For now, Saudi Arabia and Russia are likely to remain the dominant actors within OPEC+, even as the group's collective weight is reduced. Within the Gulf, the move highlights underlying differences that predate the current crisis. Coordination has often been limited despite shared security concerns. Rather than triggering an immediate rupture, analysts expect a cautious response from regional players with an emphasis on preserving stability within the bloc. Preserving stability within what remains. That is now the imperative, preventing the UAE's exit from triggering a cascade, from becoming the first piece of a domino sequence that ends with other Gulf states, calculating that their national interests are also better served outside the cartel than within it. Iraq, which has chronically exceeded its quotas and built its budget around production levels higher than OPEC allows, is watching. Kazakhstan, an OPEC Plus member with its own compliance challenges, is watching. If the UAE's exit proves commercially successful, if Abu Dhabi floods the market with 5 million barrels per day and generates the revenue to show for it without suffering diplomatic consequences, the demonstration effect on other frustrated members could be profound. The global implications extend beyond the Gulf. Every importing country, every nation whose economy depends on predictable oil prices, every central bank that watches energy costs as a driver of inflation, every manufacturer calculating whether to invest in electric vehicle supply chains, is now operating in a world where OPEC's ability to put a floor under prices in a downturn is meaningfully reduced. The market might miss Saudi's ability to put a floor under prices if oil demand is weak and there is a big surplus in the future. There is significant risk of higher oil price volatility as a result of this decision. Higher volatility in either direction, prices that spike more severely when there are supply disruptions, prices that crash more deeply when there is oversupply, creates economic uncertainty that affects investment decisions, inflation expectations, and the pace of energy transition globally. The UAE's departure from OPEC is, in that sense, a global economic event dressed in Gulf political clothing. And the power shift that the departure signals goes beyond oil markets. It signals that the architecture of Gulf Arab solidarity, the GCC, OPEC, the shared security frameworks, is being hollowed out by the divergent strategic calculations of individual states that are no longer willing to subordinate their national interests to collective frameworks controlled by their neighbors. Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Pakistan, and Egypt are building one vision of the post-war Middle East. The UAE, aligned with Israel, positioned as a global logistics hub, diversified away from oil dependence, is building another, and OPEC, which, for 50 years, was the institution where these two visions had to reach some kind of accommodation, is now the casualty of the failure to find that accommodation. MBS woke up on April 29, 2026, the day after the UAE's announcement, as the leader of an organization that was structurally weakened in a region that was geopolitically divided, with a financial model that was exposed to Hormuz risk, with a rival neighbor now producing freely without quota constraints, and with the entire architecture of the post-war Middle East still unresolved. The challenges stacked against Saudi Arabia's Vision 2030, against OPEC's relevance, against the Gulf unity that MBS has spent years trying to project as a source of regional stability, are genuine and serious. But MBS has been here before. Not exactly here. The specific confluence of challenges is unprecedented. But he has faced the moment when the game changed around him, when the assumptions of yesterday's strategy no longer held, and he has responded by moving faster and further than anyone expected. The Red Sea pivot is beginning. The PIF discipline is being restored. The alliance with Pakistan, Turkey, and Egypt is deepening. The détente with Iran, severely tested by the war but not entirely destroyed, remains a potential asset if peace holds. And Saudi Arabia still controls the world's largest oil reserves, still has more spare production capacity than any country on Earth, still sits at the intersection of 3 continents, and still has the religious legitimacy of the custodian of Mecca and Medina that no rival can replicate. The power shift that began on April 28th is real. OPEC is structurally weaker. Saudi Arabia's market management role is harder. The Gulf unity that kept the cartel together is strained. And MBS's most reliable institutional instrument for global economic leverage, the organization his country founded, led, and defined for 60 years, is diminished in ways that will take years to fully understand. But the story of whether Saudi Arabia rises to meet this challenge or is slowly diminished by it has not been written yet. What is certain is that the writing has begun. And the first sentence, delivered in a polished UAE press release on a Tuesday morning in late April, said simply, "We are leaving." The rest is still being shaped by the decisions of a 39-year-old crown prince who is reassessing, adapting, and preparing for a future that looks nothing like the present he inherited, and nothing like the present he built.